In the early hours of August 11, 2007, a group of teenagers walked into a park. Not all of them walked out the same. It was sometime between 1:10 and 1:20 in the morning, the kind of hour when the world feels paused. Streetlights hum quietly, windows are dark, and the smallest sounds carry further than they should. In a town in Lancashire, most people were asleep. But in one part of that town, there was movement. A park, open ground, paths cutting through the dark, a place that belonged to families, children, and routine during the day. At night, it belonged to whoever showed up. That night there were voices. Young voices. Casual at first. Nothing unusual about that. Groups gathered there often. Talking. Passing time. Just another late summer night. But something changed. It didn't happen all at once. There was no clear signal. No single moment that announced what was about to unfold. Instead, it built quietly. A shift in tone. A step closer than expected. A pause where there should have been laughter. Then, movement. What began as conversation turned into confrontation. And within seconds, control was lost. Two people stood at the center of it. Outnumbered. Surrounded. There were words exchanged, but whatever was said didn't matter for long. Because what followed moved beyond words. And then, there was no space left to step back. What unfolded in that park was not brief. It did not stop after a moment. It continued. Repeated. Focused. Uninterrupted. There were witnesses nearby. Some watched. Some hesitated. One voice, at least, reached for help.
I can see the ambulance police right here. I can't see where it's going.
It will do, don't worry. Calm down for me.
But by the time that call was made, the situation had already crossed a line that could not be undone. The violence continued with a level of force that made it difficult, later, for those who responded to even distinguish one from the other. Faces unrecognizable. Bodies still. The damage already set. Somewhere in the distance, sirens began to move. But inside the park, time felt slower. What had happened there was already complete. The group that had gathered began to scatter. The noise faded, and the space returned to silence. As if nothing had happened. But something had. Something that would not stay contained within that park. Something that would not be understood in a single moment. Because this was not just an act of violence. It was not just a late-night encounter that went too far. There was a reason, or at least, there would be questions about one. Questions about why these two people were chosen. Why the attack continued long after it needed to. And why no one stopped it. At first, the details were unclear. Names were not yet known. The full extent of the injuries, not yet understood. The outcome is still uncertain. But one thing was already evident. This was different. Not because of where it happened. Not because of when. But because of what it represented. In the hours that followed, as police began to piece together what had taken place, a pattern started to emerge. And with it, a possibility. That this was not random. That the victims had not just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But that something about them, something visible, had made them stand out. And that standing out had made them a target. What happened in that park forced an entire country to confront a question it wasn't ready to answer. Before that night, before the headlines, before the questions, there was a life that felt ordinary to those who lived close to it. Her name was Sophie Lancaster. She was born on November 26, 1986, in Lancashire. Raised in a place where familiarity shaped everyday life, where people knew each other, and routines rarely changed. She grew up in Haslingden, went to school there, built friendships there. Nothing about her early life suggested that her name would one day be known far beyond that town. She was not someone who sought attention, but she did not hide who she was either. Sophie expressed herself openly, through how she dressed, through how she thought, through the people she connected with. She was part of a subculture often misunderstood from the outside. The goth community. To some, that meant standing out. To others, it meant belonging. To Sophie, it was simply who she was. Her family described her as thoughtful, gentle, someone who avoided conflict rather than invited it. She was a vegetarian, a pacifist, not out of trend, but out of conviction. There was intention behind the way she lived. At the time, she was on a gap year. She had plans, clear ones. She intended to study English at college. She had considered becoming a journalist, or working with young people, paths that reflected how she saw the world, and how she wanted to be part of it. There was direction, there was time, and then there was Robert Maltby, an art student, creative in his own way, quietly aligned with Sophie, not just in interests but in outlook. They had been together for around 2 years. Long enough to understand each other. Long enough to build something steady. They lived together in Bacup, a small place on King Street. Nothing extravagant, just a shared space, a shared routine. Their lives overlapped in simple ways. Music. Conversations that stretched into the night. To people around them, they were easy to recognize. Not because of anything they did, but because of how they chose to present themselves. Their clothing, their lifestyle, it made them visible. And visibility, in a place that values sameness. Their families understood this. They described both of them as intelligent, sensitive, not troublemakers, not confrontational, but different. And that difference had not always been easy. There had been moments before. Situations where standing out drew attention they didn't ask for. But those moments passed. Life continued. Because for Sophie, difference was not something to defend. It was something to live with. On most days, her world was small in the best way. Family. Plans for what came next. Nothing about it suggested urgency. Nothing about it suggested risk. It was a life in motion, but not in danger. And on the surface, there was no reason to think that would change. To most people, she stood out. But to those who knew her, she simply belonged. On the evening of August 10, 2007, the night began without urgency. Inside a friend's house in Britannia, a suburb of Bacup, Sophie Lancaster and Robert Maltby spent the evening the way many people do. Talking, watching television, passing time. There was nothing remarkable about it. No sense that the night was building toward anything. No interruption. No warning. Just a quiet evening, stretching into the early hours. At around 11:40 p.m., they left, stepping out into the night, beginning the walk back home. The streets were mostly empty, the air still. It was late enough that movement stood out, but not so late that it felt unusual to be outside. They walked together. Familiar route. Familiar surroundings. At some point along the way, they stopped. A petrol station, lit against the dark. They went inside to buy cigarettes. And outside, on the forecourt, there was a group of teenagers. 5 of them. Among them were Brendan Harris and Ryan Herbert, alongside others, Joseph Hume, Daniel Hume, and Daniel Mallet. At first, the interaction was ordinary. A conversation. Casual. Unforced. There was no immediate tension. No raised voices. No visible conflict. Just a moment where 2 separate paths crossed. And instead of continuing on their own way, they stayed. Sophie and Robert didn't leave immediately. They remained with the group, talking, moving together, from the petrol station, toward another location, an area locally known as the Fudge Factory, and then, further still, toward a park, Stubbylee Park. Parks at that hour carry a different kind of atmosphere. During the day, they are open, predictable. At night, they become something else. Less structured, less observed. A place where groups gather without direction, where time stretches without purpose. That night, the park was not empty. There were others nearby. Teenagers moving in and out of the area. Some watching, some passing through. It was a known spot. The place people went simply to be somewhere. Nothing about that on its own stood out. And yet, something had already begun to shift. Not visibly, not clearly, but subtly. Because while the conversation had started easily, it had not stayed that way. There are moments where a situation changes without announcement. No clear beginning, No obvious cause. Just a gradual tightening. They didn't interrupt what had already begun. Because by then, the violence was no longer reactive. It had become sustained. Witnesses would later describe what they saw in pieces. One account spoke of repeated movement, figures stepping in and out. Another described confusion, not knowing who was doing what or when. There was no clear sequence, no single attacker, no single moment where it could have ended. It continued, not in a straight line, but in waves, each moment feeding into the next, each action followed by another, and in the middle of it, two people who could no longer match what was happening around them. The environment itself became part of the confusion, movement from different directions. For those watching, it was difficult to fully understand what they were seeing in real time, because it didn't resemble a typical fight. It didn't rise and fall. It didn't escalate and stop. It carried on, even after resistance began to fade, even after the outcome had already been decided. At some point, a call was made.
I can see the ambulance police right here. Yeah. I can't see where it's going.
It will do, don't worry. Calm down for me.
A voice reaching outward, trying to bring help into a situation that had already gone too far. But inside the park, the sequence continued, and the longer it continued, the harder it became to separate moments from each other. Later, police described it as a sustained attack. Not brief, not isolated, but continuous. And for those trying to reconstruct it, that continuity made it difficult to define, because there was no single turning point, no clear boundary between beginning and end, only a progression, from conversation, confrontation, to something that no longer required either. Something about this encounter doesn't feel spontaneous, not because it was planned, but because once it began, it was allowed to continue, without interruption, without hesitation, and without anyone stepping in. In time, when the movement in the park finally slowed, what remained was not clarity, fragments of what had just taken place, scattered across different perspectives. No single person present could fully describe it from beginning to end, because it had not unfolded in a straight line. It had overlapped, shifted, changed direction mid-moment. And as investigators later began to reconstruct those minutes, they were left with the same problem. Too many accounts, too many gaps, and not enough certainty. What was clear was that both victims had sustained serious injuries. Robert Maltby had been the first to fall. Witnesses consistently placed him at the center of the initial violence. Struck, overwhelmed, brought to the ground. From that point onward, his ability to respond was limited. It was later established that he lost consciousness during the attack and remembered nothing of what followed. But in those early moments, before that loss of awareness, he had been the focus, which raises the first question. Was he singled out? Or was he simply the first point of contact in something that hadn't yet chosen a direction? Sophie Lancaster entered the center of events differently, not as the initial focus, but as someone who stepped in. She moved toward Robert, positioned herself beside him, trying to protect him, trying to stop what was happening. And from that point onward, the direction of the attack changed. Witnesses described a shift, attention moving, from one victim to another. Police later described the attack as sustained. Not a single act, but something that continued over time, with repeated actions. And within that continuation, patterns begin to appear. Multiple individuals involved, not acting in perfect coordination, but not acting in isolation either, moving in and out, contributing at different moments, which introduces another question. Was there a leader? Or was this something that escalated collectively, without anyone stepping back? Some witnesses described the attackers running in, striking, then stepping away. Others recalled continuous movement, no clear pause, no clear boundary, just repetition. And within those accounts, there is another detail that begins to surface. Language. Words used during and after. Terms like mosher, a label, a way of identifying, separating, and in that moment, it becomes harder to ignore a possibility that this was not entirely random, that something about how Sophie and Robert looked, how they presented themselves, had already been noticed before the violence began, before the first strike. Earlier that night, at the petrol station, there had been no conflict. Conversation had been easy, unforced, which raises a contradiction. If nothing triggered the attack in that moment, what changed? What shifted between that encounter and the one that followed in the park? Was it the setting, the isolation, or something that had been present all along but hadn't yet surfaced? There were also inconsistencies in timing. The attack is estimated to have taken place between 1:10 and 1:20 a.m. A short window, but within that window, a great deal happened. Too much, in fact, to easily map, which complicates the narrative because it forces investigators and viewers to rely on partial reconstruction, moments remembered out of order, voices recalled without clear context, actions described without certainty of sequence. And in cases like this, uncertainty creates space. Space for interpretation. Space for doubt. What is known is that both victims were left with severe head injuries. So severe, that detail alone changes the way the attack is understood, because it suggests intensity, not just in how it began, but in how it continued. By the time emergency services reached Stubbylee Park, the violence had already ended. What remained was its aftermath. Two bodies, unmoving, barely distinguishable from one another. Their faces so severely injured that responders struggled in those first moments to tell which one was male and which one was female. It was no longer a question of what had happened. It was a question of survival. Robert Maltby was still alive, but unconscious. His injuries, serious, internal, complex. He was taken first to Rochdale Infirmary, placed under immediate care. And though his condition was critical, there was still a path forward, a possibility of recovery. But beside him, the situation was different. Sophie Lancaster had sustained severe head trauma, repeated blows, a level of injury that extended beyond what could be immediately stabilized. She was placed on life support, transferred between hospitals, first to Fairfield General Hospital, then to the neurology unit at Hope Hospital in Salford. Doctors began their assessment, scans, observations, neurological responses, each test narrowing the range of outcomes, each result removing another possibility. This quiet, controlled, and then the conclusion, not delivered all at once, but built piece by piece. Through medical certainty, there would be no recovery, no return to consciousness, no reversal. She never regained consciousness. For 13 days, Sophie Lancaster remained in a coma, but unreachable. Machines sustaining what her body could no longer manage on its own. And during those 13 days, the story began to change, because what had started as an assault investigation was now becoming something else, something irreversible. Her family arrived. Among them, her mother, Sylvia Lancaster. There are moments in cases like this that are never fully captured in reports, moments that exist outside timelines and evidence, moments that happen in hospital rooms, in silence, in waiting, where hope is not lost all at once, but fades gradually as each update brings less certainty than the last. For Sylvia, those days were not defined by what had already happened, but by what might still change, what might still be reversed. Because as long as there is time, there is possibility, even when the odds say otherwise. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, the first details of the attack began to reach the public. Not all at once, not fully, but enough to raise questions. 2 young people attacked in a park. No provocation, no clear motive, and one detail that began to stand out. They had been targeted because they looked different. The word Mosher appeared again, used during the attack, used afterward, a label tied to identity, to appearance, to belonging within a subculture. And suddenly, This was no longer just about violence. It was about perception, about difference, about how quickly difference can become a reason. Inside the hospital, the timeline continued, day after day. Machines, monitoring, waiting, until eventually, the decision could no longer be delayed. Doctors had already determined there was no chance of recovery, and so, on August 24, 2007, life support was withdrawn. Sophie Lancaster was 20 years old. In that moment, the case crossed a line. What had been classified as grievous bodily harm was now murder, and everything that followed would be built on that change. Public reaction began to grow, first locally, then beyond, because the circumstances didn't fit neatly into a single explanation. There was no robbery, no prior conflict, no clear trigger, only a difference in appearance, and an escalation that had gone too far. For a minute, that raised a deeper question, not just about what happened in that park, but about why it happened at all. And once that question is asked, it doesn't stay contained. By the time the case was formally classified as murder, the focus shifted from what happened to what, and almost immediately, there was no single answer. At first glance, the explanation seemed straightforward. Two young people, visibly part of an alternative subculture, targeted, attacked, left critically injured. The word used during the assault, Mosher, suggested recognition, identification, a label that reduced them to something separate, something outside. And for many, that pointed clearly in one direction. This was a hate crime, an attack driven by appearance, by difference, by intolerance. But as the investigation deepened, that certainty began to loosen, because the events leading up to the attack did not fit cleanly into that narrative. Earlier that same night, at a petrol station, there had been no hostility, no confrontation, just conversation, normal, unforced, even friendly. And more than that, Sophie Lancaster and Robert Maltby had chosen to continue walking with the group. There had been no immediate threat, no signal that anything was about to change, which introduces a contradiction. If they were targeted because of how they looked, why wasn't the attack immediate? Why wait? Why allow the interaction to continue before it turned? Police began reconstructing the timeline, piece by piece, interviewing witnesses, reviewing statements, tracing movement from the petrol station to the area known as the Fudge Factory, and finally into Stubbylee Park. And within that reconstruction, another pattern began to emerge. The presence of a group, not one individual acting alone, but several, moving together, influencing each other, responding to each other, which raises a different kind of question. Was this driven by intent or by escalation? Because group dynamics change behavior. What one person might not do alone can become possible in a group. Responsibility diffuses, boundaries shift, actions intensify, and in those conditions, violence can grow quickly, faster than expected, faster than controlled. There was also prior history. Two of the individuals later identified, Ryan Herbert and Brendan Harris, had been involved in a previous assault in the same park. Just months earlier, an incident involving stamping and violence against another teenager. Not identical, but not unrelated either, which complicates the narrative further, because it suggests a pattern, not necessarily of targeting a specific subculture, but of behavior, of escalation, of what happens when aggression is not interrupted early. And then there were the arrests. Lancashire police moved quickly. 5 teenage boys taken into custody. But even then, the investigation did not immediately close, because reports indicated that more people had been present in the park that night. 15, maybe 20 individuals at different points. Some watching, some nearby, some possibly involved, but not all directly participating, which leaves another uncomfortable question. How many people saw what was happening before it was too late? Interviews continued, statements collected, and in those interviews, behavior emerged that added another layer of contradiction. During questioning, One of the suspects, Brendan Harris, was described as laughing, joking, not fully grasping, or not acknowledging the seriousness of what had taken place. That reaction alone forces a difficult reflection because it challenges the idea of intent. Not in terms of action, the actions were undeniable, but in terms of understanding. Was this calculated, or was it something carried out without fully processing the consequences? And then there is the central question, the one that continues to divide interpretation. Was this a hate crime, or was it opportunistic violence that found its justification afterward? Because both possibilities exist within the same set of facts. They were called moshers. They were visibly different. They were attacked, but they were also approached first, spoken to, walked with, and only later did everything change. By the time the case reached court, that question had sharpened into something more precise. Who did what, and who is responsible for her death? The trial began on March 10, 2008, at Preston Crown Court. 5 teenage boys stood accused. But from the very first day, the structure of responsibility began to shift. All 5 defendants admitted to grievous bodily harm with intent against Robert Maltby. That admission mattered. It confirmed that what happened in Stubbylee Park was not a misunderstanding, not a brief confrontation that got out of hand. It was a sustained assault. But the central question remained: who was responsible for the death of Sophie Lancaster? Because participation alone is not the same as causing death. And the court needed to draw that line carefully. Then came the first decisive break in the case. Ryan Herbert pleaded guilty to murder. No argument, no denial. A direct acknowledgement that his actions had crossed into lethal territory. But Brendan Harris did the opposite. He pleaded not guilty to murder, which meant the jury had to answer something far more difficult than a simple timeline. Was he equally responsible, or just part of a group that went out of control? The prosecution began to rebuild the events minute by minute. Not dramatically, not emotionally, but structurally. They walked the jury through the initial meeting at the petrol station, at the movement toward the fudge factory, at the group entering the park together. Up to this point, nothing overtly hostile, which tied directly back to the earlier mystery. There was no clear trigger, no argument, no provocation. Then the shift, sudden, unpredictable. Violence began. Witness testimony became critical. Fragments from different perspectives started aligning. A group surrounding the couple. Multiple attackers striking in sequence. No effort to stop once it began. And one detail repeated across accounts: the attack didn't stop when resistance ended. And according to the prosecution, 2 individuals stood out in that persistence: Ryan Herbert and Brendan Harris. They were identified not just as participants, but as the ones who continued the attack. When both victims were already defenseless, the defense attempted to blur that clarity. They argued confusion in the dark, lack of specific intent, a situation that went beyond control. But the prosecution countered with something simple and difficult to ignore. This was not a single blow, not a momentary lapse. It was repeated action, deliberate continuation. And that distinction was everything. Then came a statement that reframed the entire case. Sophie and Robert were singled out, not for anything they had said or done, but because they looked and dressed differently. That single line tied directly back to the earlier uncertainty. The gothic appearance. The word mosher used during the emergency call. What once seemed like background detail now became central. The question wasn't fully resolved. Was it purely a hate-driven attack? Or did appearance simply make them easier targets? But the court didn't need to answer motive completely. It needed to establish responsibility. On March 27, 2008, the jury delivered its decision. Ryan Herbert was found guilty of murder alongside Brendan Harris guilty of murder. The line had been drawn. Not everyone present that night bore equal responsibility, but these 2 had crossed it. The remaining 3 defendants, Joseph Hume, Daniel Hume, and Daniel Mallet, were convicted of grievous bodily harm. Their involvement acknowledged. their role defined, but distinct from the fatal outcome. April 28, 2008. The courtroom returned for sentencing. The judge's words were direct. He described the attack as feral thuggery. Not impulsive, not misunderstood, but behavior stripped of restraint. Brendan Harris was sentenced life imprisonment. Minimum term, 18 years. Ryan Herbert was also sentenced life imprisonment. Minimum term, 16 years and 3 months. The other 3 received prison sentences for their roles in the assault on Robert Maltby. And just like that, the chaos of that night, the confusion, the contradictions, the unanswered questions, were reduced to something structured: actions, evidence, responsibility. But here's the part that stays with you. The court answered who. It answered what happened. It even clarified how it unfolded. But the deeper question from the beginning doesn't disappear so easily. Why did no one stop it? Because understanding the crime is one thing. Understanding how it was allowed to continue is something else entirely. The courtroom had delivered its answer. Sentences. Accountability. But outside those walls, the story didn't end. It expanded. In the days following the death of Sophie Lancaster, Stubbylee Park transformed. Not into a crime scene anymore, but into a place of mourning. Flowers covered the grass. Handwritten notes. Candles burning through the night. Strangers, many who had never met her, stood in silence. Because what happened didn't feel distant. It felt possible. At the center of that grief was one voice that refused to fade into silence. Sylvia Lancaster. A mother who had lost her daughter, but chose not to retreat. Instead, she stepped forward. She spoke not only about Sophie's life, but about what her death represented. Not just violence, but intolerance. A deeper issue that many had experienced quietly for years.
But she was a lovely young girl, and I'm not just saying that because I'm a mum. On the one hand, she was really quite shy, quite introverted, and yet on the other hand, she could be quite bubbly and quite chatty. I think it depended what mood she was in, actually. When she got to 11 and 12, and she started being alternative. Mind you, she'd always been alternative, is a reality. But she chose to show that in her clothes and things. She would spend hours actually, putting the makeup on. Her nail varnish had to be right. But she was quite distinctive in the way that she looked. She very often looked quite grungy, I suppose, as well, But people did used to stop, actually, and look at her. They were very similar, I think. They liked the same sort of things, same sort of interests. And, Rob was a very intelligent young man. And I was Sophie could hold her own with him. I was hoping that she and Rob would be together, forever. I would hope they'd get married and have children.
And that's where the shift begins. Because this case didn't stay confined to one town. It started conversations across the entire country. Was this a hate crime? The answer wasn't simple. Police had already suggested that the couple's appearance, their connection to the goth subculture, may have played a role. Recognition of difference. But legally, at the time, alternative subculture wasn't clearly defined within hate crime protections. That gap became the focus. Not just for grieving families, but for communities who saw themselves reflected in what happened. Musicians, artists, fans of alternative culture. From the UK to Europe, even beyond. They weren't just reacting to a tragedy. They were recognizing a pattern. Within months, something tangible emerged. Sophie Lancaster Foundation, founded in her name. Not as a memorial alone, but as a response. Its purpose was direct, to challenge prejudice, to educate young people about tolerance, to push for recognition of crimes based on identity, not just race or religion, but appearance and subculture. And it didn't stay symbolic. The foundation entered schools, festivals, communities, turning a single case into an ongoing conversation. Pressure began to build. Petitions were created. Debates were raised in government. Should attacks like this be treated the same way as other hate crimes? Public figures began to speak. Discussions reached Parliament. And while the law itself didn't immediately change, something else did. Sentencing perspective. In 2009, guidance shifted. Judges were encouraged to treat attacks based on subcultural identity as an aggravating factor, not invisible anymore, not dismissed as random. Then in 2013, a more concrete step. Police in Greater Manchester began officially recording attacks against alternative communities as hate crimes.
A year ago, Greater Manchester Police became the first force in the country to recognise crimes committed against people from alternative subcultures where they are motivated by hate are official hate crimes. That was a really important step, particularly for those who live and spend their time as an alternative subculture. Goths, emos, punks, there are many people out there. The law only recognises hate crime against those who are from a protected characteristic. But here in Greater Manchester Police, we believe that hate is hate, no matter what the motivation. And we have to iron out hate crime across the whole of Greater Manchester. And we were inspired by the work of Sylvia Lancaster, whose daughter Sophie was tragically murdered just because of the way she looked. She was kicked to death in a park in Lancashire just because of the way she looked. And Sylvia's been working tirelessly to raise the understanding of what hate crime against those from alternative subcultures really is like and has the impact. So here in Greater Manchester, because of her work, because of our commitment to tackle hate crime no matter what the motivation, Greater Manchester Police a year ago made that very important step, and that has made a big difference to our confidence in those to come forward and tell us about their experiences. Well, the feedback from the communities has been exceptional. Clearly, when we made the announcement that we were going to treat it as hate crime, the positive feedback we got and the confidence we instilled in those people from alternative subcultures was really, astronomical. And we've also begun to see forces around the United Kingdom also taking that step now. So where Greater Manchester Police have led, others are now following. Here in Greater Manchester, we've recorded 14 hate crimes against people from alternative subcultures in the last 12 months. And 11 people have received a sanction because of their involvement in those hate crimes. That may be small numbers, but we are gaining the confidence of people, we're demonstrating our commitment to stamp out hate crime, and we're bringing confidence to those who belong to alternative subcultures that Greater Manchester Police will take it seriously and take action, and that is the important thing. The important thing is to get all of our officers understanding what it's like to be a member of an alternative subculture. Just as much as we work really hard in getting officers to understand what hate crime against transsexuals or for lesbian gay people or disabled people, we've been working really hard at motivating our staff to understand what it's like to be a victim of hate crime. So this year we're rolling out further training for hate crime against alternative subcultures to our frontline staff. And we're very pleased that Sylvia Lancaster decided to give up some of her time to come in and tell our officers exactly what it's like living as somebody who visually looks very, very different, but underneath is just a normal person. A normal person who wants to go about their business, free to choose to look however they look, and to understand that a police service will throw its weight of protection around them if they are a victim of hate crime. And that's what we're going to do in the next year. Here in Greater Manchester, there are a number of ways that people can report their experience of being a victim of hate crime. They can contact the police through the normal 101 number, or if it's an emergency, using 999. But if they don't feel comfortable in making that first phone call, or they don't feel comfortable in having direct contact with the police, there are other ways that people can report being a victim of hate crime. We have a number of reporting centres around Greater Manchester. They're on our website, and people can go to those centres, which are in the communities, not run by the police, and report hate crime there and know that it's going to be investigated. In addition, we allow people to report hate crime on the internet, on the True Vision website, which is www.reportit.org, and people can report hate crime through that way as well. We want to make it easy and accessible for people who are victims of hate crime to have the confidence to come forward. We know sometimes it's embarrassing, sometimes it's difficult, and sometimes it hurts to be able to admit you're a victim of hate crime. And that's why we provide a number of ways people to come forward, because we want to investigate, because we want to stamp out hate crime no matter what the motivation.
That's the ripple effect. Not instant, not perfect, but undeniable. The story of Sophie Lancaster didn't disappear with the verdict. In art, in music, in storytelling, a BBC production, public performances, each one trying to process the same question from a different angle. How does something like this happen? Even Robert Maltby, who survived, chose for a long time to stay away from the spotlight. When he eventually spoke years later, his perspective added complexity. He questioned whether labeling it purely as a hate crime oversimplified something deeper, a broader problem of youth violence and social behavior. And that matters, because it reminds us, not every answer fits neatly into one category. The impact didn't stop at policy. It became personal. Young people began to think twice about how they dressed in certain areas. Others refused to change at all, choosing visibility over fear. Memorials were created, concerts held in her name.
Into the blue, we understate our standards now, standing into in blue. She grows in you. We are the Russian dolls, all in a row, out of the blue. It went straight to the head, and I missed what you said when you left me alone in the room. By hook or by crook, I distinguished the look, and they blind me the deaf to their beds. What was it said? What was it said?
A stage at a major festival renamed in tribute. A bench placed overlooking the sea in Whitby, and perhaps the most lasting part. Education. Conversations in classrooms. Discussions about identity, difference, and respect. The justice system answered what happened. The public response asked something bigger. What kind of society allows difference to become a target? Because this wasn't just about one night in a park. It was about what led up to it. The jokes, the labels, the normalization of seeing someone as other. And the uncomfortable truth is, those things don't begin with violence. They begin much earlier. She stood out, and for that, she was seen. The question is, what did people choose to see? There's a tendency after a case like this to search for closure, a verdict, a sentence, a name for what happened. Something that allows us to file it away, as solved. But some stories don't stay contained. The story of Sophie Lancaster resists that. Because even after the courtrooms emptied, after the headlines faded, after the prison doors closed behind Ryan Herbert and Brendan Harris, the question never really left. What actually triggered it? Not the moment, not the violence, but the decision before the violence. A look, a label, a judgment made in seconds. In Stubbylee Park, that night didn't begin with something obvious. It began with recognition of difference. Not everyone in that park attacked. Some watched. Some walked away. Some called for help. That matters, because it shows something uncomfortable. Violence isn't always universal. It's chosen. Even years later, Robert Maltby would question how the world defined what happened. Not to excuse it, but to challenge how simple explanations can hide deeper truths. And maybe that's why this case still lingers. Because it forces a mirror, not just on the attackers, but on the environment around them. The jokes people ignore. The insults that pass as normal. The quiet ways society signals who belongs and who doesn't. Sophie Lancaster didn't die because of who she hurt. She died because of who she was. So the story doesn't end with her. It shifts us. How do we define difference? And why does it still provoke violence? If this story made you think, don't just move on. Leave your thoughts in the comments. What do you think this case really represents? And if you want more stories like this, stories that go deeper than headlines, make sure you like the video and subscribe, because the next story is already waiting.